Hi everyone, I'm Anthony Leoy, and this is my talk, Miyazaki Seriously. In this talk, I'm going to argue that the reasons for including Hayao Miyazaki, the Japanese animator's work, in the teaching canon of ecomedia studies are the same reasons that his work addresses the problems posed by this conference and its theme, A Clockwork Green. So first, I'm going to talk about my understanding of this problem. Second, I'm going to introduce Miyazaki and his work. Third, I'm going to offer analyses of 3 of his most important films for our purposes. And then finally, I'm going to offer some concluding thoughts. So I thought I would begin by telling a story that sort of repeats every time I go to MLA or to ASLE, where I encounter another Miyazaki fan, either a Japanese scholar or an Anglophone scholar, and we sort of shake our fists and say, why isn't there more Miyazaki in this conference? Because it's obvious to us that Miyazaki and his work are important for the project of eco-criticism and the environmental humanities. So this is my attempt to compensate for that problem, I think. So let me talk first about my understanding of A Clockwork Green. I think that there are 2 versions of this problem, and I understand that the first version is an accusation against eco-criticism, that eco-criticism, especially in its early forms in the 90s, wanted to transmit an environmentalist ideology through pedagogy in a way implied by the parallel between Clockwork Green and Clockwork Orange. Right? So the idea here being that eco-critics kind of want to force open the eyes of our students and make them see the truth of our ecological situation, whether they want to see it or not. And I think that this is a useful provocation, but that it's actually unfair. And I think a more reasonable reading of that history goes something like this. Eco-critics have often been not only students of the Romantics, but Romantics ourselves. Romantics philosophically, not just in a scholarly sense. And what that means is that the more obvious category is not Althusserian institutional apparatus, but Bildung, right? In other words, a story of the way a young person grows up and acquires proper culture and is acculturated into middle-class society properly. And so I think that it's more reasonable to see early eco-critical pedagogy in this light as a way of trying to create grown-ups, right, students who have techniques for becoming ecological citizens. Let's put it that way. So the second accusation in Clockwork Green is that ecomedia studies has not sufficiently taken into account its own relationship to the material economy of ecomedia. And I think that this is quite right, and that we absolutely need to do that. There have been some important beginning steps, but I'm recommending Miyazaki here because I think that, first of all, relative to provocation 1, his work actually disrupts the lessons of the Bildung and the structure of the Bildung and its assumptions in a useful way, and that in terms of provocation 2, Miyazaki's work is always drawing attention to modern ambivalence toward technology and its relationship to nature, and a kind of not just a love-hate relationship with high technology, but a love-fear relationship. And so he does this across multiple movies, too many to talk about right now, but I'm going to try to summarize some of the most important things. But first, I'm going to give a little bit of background to his career. So Miyazaki is often said in the United States to be the quote-unquote Japanese Walt Disney, which I think is an obvious comparison, but also incorrect. I would rather say he is animation's Akira Kurosawa. And what I mean by that is that Kurosawa, of course, is the famous auteur whose work became popular in Japan and then traveled internationally, so that now he's a kind of global icon of Japanese cinema. And likewise, I think Miyazaki has become that figure for animation. Miyazaki was born in 1941. He is the co-founder of Studio Ghibli, arguably the most important animation studio in history. Next to Disney, certainly, but it has also been widely influential among the Franco-Belgian tradition of comics and animation, as well as the Anglo-American and Anglo-Canadian traditions of animation. So that after Disney's movie Lilo and Stitch, you can obviously see that as much as Japanese anime and Miyazaki in particular were influenced by the Disney tradition then is counter-influenced by him. You can't watch Lilo and Stitch after having seen Miyazaki and miss the rather direct influence. In this sense, Roger Ebert has argued that Miyazaki may in fact be the greatest and most important director of animation in history. So that is a little bit of background for him. There's much more to say, and I'm going to try to say some of it in my analysis of the following three films. The first film I want to talk about is called, in English, Castle in the Sky. It is originally called Laputa, right? So, and sometimes those two are combined, Laputa, Castle in the Sky. This is a story about a plucky young hero named Pazu, who's from a mining town, who discovers a girl who falls from the sky. Her name is Shita. She turns out to be the princess of a lost kingdom in the air called Laputa, a flying island, which is modeled, by the way, in part after Jonathan Swift's Science Island in Gulliver's Travels. That's where the name Laputa comes from. And so they go off together to find her heritage, and they do indeed find this floating kingdom in the sky, which I think of as an ecotopia. Long story short, it turns out that Laputa, the flying island, is a place where artificially intelligent robots take care of a beautiful pastoral island that has its own flora and fauna and is organized around a beautiful central tree, which is really like a world tree, like a kind of Japanese Yggdrasil from Norse mythology. And of course, the problem with this setup is that Laputa is also a weapons platform, and specifically is a weapons platform that has atomic capability. So Laputa, it turns out, used to be a global empire that Shita's ancestors used to dominate the world, and which passed into folklore, so that the movie says that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the story of Indra's arrow in Indian mythology all derive from Laputa. And the action of the story is that Pazu and Shita manage to destroy the weapons platform but preserve the ecotopia. But ironically, the destruction of the weapons platform then sends the island farther into the sky, basically into orbit around Earth, so that no one is able to live there. So what's important for me about this story in terms of A Clockwork Green is that Laputa is a story about the way high technology and pastoral landscapes can go together, and in particular about the way that artificial intelligence embodied by caretaker robots are sometimes like that AI is a better companion to non-human species than humans are. And the prime example of this that I want to talk about is represented by their encounter with a guardian robot when they first land on the island. So they land on this beautiful gliding, flying machine, and they land over, unbeknownst to them, over a bird's nest. And this giant robot, who in other scenes, right, his type of robot has been shown to be a weapon of war. In this scene, he is seen to be a protector of the beasts of Laputa. So he comes not to threaten them, but to lift their glider off the nest, right? And to make this point, which I unfortunately can't show you for copyright reasons in the original, to make this point, the robot gently lifts off the glider from the nest, right? And then this moment happens. I have a picture of it. Let's see if it shows up on the camera. So here's the robot, and here are Pazu and Chita. And if you can see, there is a tiny flower in the robot's hand, right? And so the robot is shown to be a kind of gardener and a guardian of both the plants and animals of Laputa. And so I remember very clearly seeing this movie when it was first released in the late 80s and being completely flummoxed by the idea of an ecotopia that looks like this. There's Laputa from above, combining high technology and artificial intelligence in a way that essentially is better off without humanity. And in that sense, Laputa is a kind of exemplary post-humanist text that we might explore. So it makes us conscious of the way we take technology as a negative force for granted, and that we need to think more critically about the way technology and the biosphere might interact without us. So the second example here, oh, and by the way, in terms of the question of the Bildung, the confusing thing for Anglo-American viewers is that the boy and the girl do not get married at the end, right? So if you've been trained by Disney to expect the prince and the princess to get married, or the in this case, the thief or the plucky peasant boy to marry the princess, that doesn't happen. And American audiences are actually very confused by this in a pattern that continues with the other movies. So the next movie I want to talk about is Princess Mononoke, which is a story about Prince Ashitaka, who's a member of the indigenous Ainu people of Japan, and a figure who is called Princess Mononoke, which might be translated as Princess Monster Spirit. And their encounter with a woman named Lady Eboshi, and the drama that ensues, because Mononoke is a wolf girl. She has been raised by the wolf goddess Moro as one of her children, an adopted wolf child. And she is a defender of the forest against Lady Eboshi and her project as the builder of a place called Irontown, which is a forge, among other things, and provides weapons for various political entities inside Japan, right? So we're at a moment of early modernity here, where the forest still has gods, and they are angry at the way they're being encroached upon by proto-industrial technology. So the thing that I think is important about Mononoke is, for our purposes, is that it poses a contradiction rather than a harmony between social justice and environmental justice. And what I mean by that is Irontown is a place where Lady Eboshi has taken societal outcasts, especially lepers and ex-prostitutes, and brought them together to live in a harmonious city-state that she rules benevolently. So that, in fact, from a social perspective, Lady Eboshi looks like a kind of messiah figure, but from the perspective of the forest, especially from the perspective of Mononoke, she's a destructive interloper who kills gods in order to institute and extractive mining technology on the mountains that would otherwise be guarded by the boar gods and the wolf gods. And Ashitaka, as an outsider to both of these groups, tries to act as a mediator and to some extent succeeds. But at the end of the movie, the major forest spirit, the protective spirit of the forest that Irontown is located in, has been killed. Then he is resurrected, but not without great damage to the forest. The wolf goddess Moro has been destroyed, so Mononoke has lost her mother. And indeed, there's a kind of standoff, right, where Eboshi promises to try to live more harmoniously with the forest, but we know that really doesn't happen, and that is represented, that future of failure is represented by the fact that that the primary three characters, Ashitaka, Mononoke, and Eboshi, all face each other at the end of the movie and then go their separate ways. And so again, there is no harmony between social justice in Irontown and environmental justice between the town and the forest. And that is then exacerbated from an Anglo-American perspective by the fact that, again, the prince and the princess don't get married. In fact, what they do is simply decide to continue their détente. Like, basically, it's like, I'll call you later. Which is very confusing to global audiences who are used to Disney plots. And then the third movie that I want to talk about is Spirited Away, which is, at first, seems to be a kind of classic fairy tale, like a human girl gets lost in the fairy world. It draws very extensively on Irish fairy tales, on British fairy tales, about humans who get lost in the woods and get kidnapped by fairies. And so the protagonist's name is Chihiro. She is a young girl who gets lost in fairyland and then has to make her own way. And in this quest, she is helped by a mysterious character named Haku, who seems to work for the local witch, who runs everything in fairy world. But in fact, Haku is the lost spirit of a small river, the Kohaku River, that Chihiro almost drowned in accidentally when she was a little girl. And so we see in flashback Chihiro almost drowning, and then the current bringing her to shore, which we understand as Haku, the spirit of the river, the dragon of the river, rescuing her from death. And so at the end of the movie, Chihiro and Haku look like this, right? So that's the central couple of the film. And the action of the movie is really to help Chihiro remember this incident and to rekindle her loyalty to the river, and at the same time to restore Haku's memory of his own prior existence as a river who has been buried and partially destroyed, certainly disrupted by suburban development around Tokyo. And so there's a happy ending where Chihiro makes her way out of the fairy world and back to her parents, but the action of the movie very strongly criticizes the way the expansion of Tokyo has destroyed the natural environment around Tokyo. Obviously, when one of the protagonists is a buried river whose partial destruction is represented by his loss of memory to his own identity, right? Spirited Away is a kind of ecological Bildung, right, where the thing that is being educated about the need for a new set of relationships is not only the little human girl, but also her fairy friend, who has been injured by humans and by sort of rampant development of a Japanese megalopolis, right? And so what we see in all three of these movies, right, is a disruption of the sort of traditional romantic pedagogical structure of the Bildung. People have to grow up, but their growing up doesn't turn out quite the way you expect it to. And furthermore, their growing up results in their understanding that they themselves are part, their history is part of an environmental destruction that cannot be easily taken back, easily healed, and that they themselves are not able single-handedly to stop it, right? And so for Anglo-American viewers in particular, these movies pose the question, right? What do we assume about the affordances of environmental pedagogy? Like, what do we expect to learn? What do we expect to teach to students? And what is the relationship of that teaching to the environmental destruction portrayed in the movie and that we see all around us in the real world? And indeed, how do we then craft an approach in the classroom and in our public outreach that allows people to come to these conclusions themselves in a way that doesn't become a Clockwork Green, but also definitely unsettles people through a kind of alienation effect where their expectations for what an environmental film is, what an ecological narrative accomplishes, and what the take-home lessons are, like all of those expectations are disrupted by Miyazaki's work. So finally, in that light, I would like to offer a few conclusions. And so the first one is that it's important to recognize that Miyazaki and his work have already raised the questions that this conference is asking, right? So that alone, I think, should make him a key figure in ecomedia studies. But I also want to say, in a kind of PS way, his work is extremely beautiful, right? And so, in fact, I would say enchanting. Most people think it's enchanting as a visual experience. And so it kind of defies the notion that film cannot be beautiful and critical at the same time, right? And that's really important, I think, for the project of ecomedia studies, especially for the development of eco-aesthetic theory. So the second point is that, as I've said, Miyazaki tends to use the premises of the Bildung and the premises of pastoral narrative to question themselves, right? So that you don't emerge from his stories of children growing up with a kind of pat sense that everybody lives happily ever after or all the problems have been solved, especially not by the marriage plot, because nobody gets married, right? So one other thing to keep in mind from a queer ecological perspective, right, is that Miyazaki disrupts the idea that traditional marriage solves all of the social problems around it and harmonizes things that have trouble being harmonized otherwise. The third point is that Miyazaki, I think, actively prevents easy ideological indoctrination because there is a heavily critical element in all of his work, right? So you're never allowed to experience a beautiful pastoral scene without seeing the way that right next door there's a war, right? You're never allowed to experience ecotopia without understanding that the power that makes the floating island in the sky beautiful is also the power that allows it to be a weapon of war, and so on, right? So I'm not quite sure that that's dialectical, but it is certainly critical in the technical sense. Fourth, I think that Miyazaki is honest about the modern love, our love of technology, even as he criticizes our uses of technology to abet empire, war, and ecological destruction. So what he wants to do is to hold love and fear of technology in tension, and I think he does that very successfully. And as I said, I think he anticipates the post-human turn in suggesting that the problem is not in a deterministic way what industrial or post-industrial technology or artificial intelligence does on its own or as a consequence of its own form, but rather the problem is humans, right? And that we need to take responsibility for that rather than blaming the behavior of our giant robots or our extractive technologies or our weapons platforms on those things themselves as if we are helpless against them, right? And then finally, I would like to say that for those of you who are interested in further exploration of Miyazaki's work, I mean, there's so much, but the other two films that you should definitely watch if you have not are Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind. That's actually spelled Nausicaa. It's the character from the Odyssey. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind, and also My Neighbor Totoro, which has spawned no end of cute toys, but is also an important movie in and of itself. And I'm going to put some links to these films in the doobly-doo below the video. And so thank you for listening. That concludes my argument, at least for the moment. Go in peace to watch some Miyazaki. Thank you.